96 FM used to be the best radio station in Perth until it was bought out and the downfall of radio. Hey everyone, Liam from Solitude here, and today I'm going to be talking about what I believe used to be the best radio station in Perth but no longer is, that being 96 FM, a commercial radio station that's been around since the 80s here in Western Australia. So 96 FM were one of the first commercial radio stations in Western Australia. For most of the 80s and 90s, they played top 40 chart-topping hits, and they were the go-to station for most music fans who jumped in their car and turned the radio on. Now, obviously, I did not grow up in the 80s and early 90s, so I can't profess to know much about what 96 FM was like back then, but what I do know is that once it hit the 2000s, there was a saturation in the market for radio stations in Perth. And remember, at this time, it was essentially the only way people could get free music in their ears was turning on their radio. So radio was a huge way that people found music that they would come to like. There was essentially 4 major commercial stations around, 3 of them, including 96 FM, all pretty much playing chart-topping hits. One station, 94.5, played more kind of old classic music that was for an older generation of people. I think because 96 FM realized that they were just competing with the same market as 92.9 and Nova when they came along, they decided they wanted to find a little bit more of a niche. So they lent more into a kind of rock direction and focused a lot on Australian and subsequently West Australian music. And it was when they brought out their slogan of Perth's best music that I believe that this station was at its pinnacle and clearly the best radio station in Perth. What made them so good was that they were almost like a community commercial radio station, because all of their shows were done locally. They focused on playing local Australian and West Australian music, and there was a strong connection with their audience. It also felt like that the people who were running the station and picking the songs to get played on the playlist had a good connection with what was popular, good and up and coming in the local rock music scenes in Australia and Western Australia. I think it was probably easier back then too, with a lot of that music actually hitting the charts anyway, not like today. And this is essentially how I personally got my love for music, listening to this radio station. So growing up in the 2000s mostly, and getting in the car, my parents would always put on 96 FM. They would never deviate from that station because it was the best. It had the best music played, the most variety, the least annoying presenters, and it had a playlist that was able to cater to people interested in finding new music, and also it catered towards that kind of older 80s generation of Australian music lovers that essentially they built their fan base on when they first came out. They would play quite a lot of classic Australian pub rock from the likes of Cold Chisel, Midnight Oil, AC/DC, INXS, but then they would also play quite a lot of modern rock music that was coming out. So there was a huge focus on playing the latest Grinspoon, Powderfinger, Silverchair songs and other acts like that. And West Australian music too was very prominent at this time in that genre. We always got to hear the latest Eskimo Joe, Little Birdie, Gyroscope and End of Fashion songs on this station. And they would always do their best to show us the new British and American stuff that was getting big in the alternative rock scene as well. Of course, you would hear a lot of Foo Fighters, The Killers, Kings of Leon, heaps of Coldplay, Robbie Williams, Snow Patrol, stuff like that. They also played a lot of that kind of folk rock stuff, which was really big around the mid-2000s. Guys like Jack Johnson, of course, and your Australian alternatives, Pete Murray, the John Butler Trio, Ben Lee. So it was just a great blend of old and new and gave a wide variety of people a lot to like. Also, I have to say, their presenters were pretty good. Their morning show was pretty popular. A guy by the name of Fitzy was the main one. There was a revolving door of presenters that always just ended up being Fitzy's sidekick for about 10 years. Also really liked Darren DeMello. You could tell that he had a great musical brain and knew a lot about older music and also modern music coming out too. And they also did this really cool competition, I think like every couple of hours of the day, called a superset, where they would play 5 songs chosen by the presenter at the time that all had some sort of theme that connected them together, and listeners would have to call up and predict what the theme was or work out what the theme was, and whoever predicts it would win a CD or something like that. But overall, the thing that was great about them was that they were focusing on music. Music was at the forefront of the existence of the station. And by the time 2012 came around, it actually went to number 1 in Perth for the first time since the early 90s. So it overtook the top 40 stations And it did this from absolutely nowhere by not catering to what essentially the masses like. It was around this time that they rebranded and lent into their sound a little bit more with a new slogan that said "Keeping Real Music Alive" and a new logo. But unfortunately, around this time, it was a difficult period for the station to sustain that top spot that it got. And there are a couple of reasons why. Number one, I would say, is that around 2012 was probably also the time that rock music commercially started dying down a lot. It was probably hard for the presenters to find new up-and-coming rock music that the owners of the station were willing to play. Now, since the existence of the station as well, there were many buyouts and the station was always being sold to a new, bigger company. But it was around this time it also got sold to the Australian Radio Network, and this was the killer blow. This is the station that owns Kiss, that Kyle and Jackie O go onto. Things started happening, such as over East shows coming onto the network, like Kyle and Jackie O. You could tell there was less focus on playing new up-and-coming rock music, and it was more about playing the same repeated hits over and over again that we all knew. Essentially, the station became extremely conservative and really stale, and it got to essentially about the mid to late 2010s where this station was still going, but it just had a very conservative, dire, boring sound in my opinion. And there was a bit of a shake-up in the radio market in Western Australia, in Perth, when Triple M officially came in for the first time, taking over 92.9, which was a top 40 station. The other station that company owned in Western Australia, 94.5, swapped to be a little bit more of a hit station, as well as still playing oldie classics too. So what we've seen now is that the three major stations kind of all just swap places, and Nova has just stayed the same. But I suppose the greatest issue with all of this though is radio in general. Radio is just a dying medium. With streaming and Spotify and Apple Music and things like that now being so accessible, you can get any music that you want at any time, and a lot of people just turn on Spotify on their phone once they get in their car and don't even bother putting on a radio. We're now left to be in a position where in Perth, I generally don't believe we have a good radio station at all, especially commercially, and there might be an argument out there for community stations, but I'll have a chat about that. So I have a background in community radio. I did 3 years volunteering at one that was called 89.7, formerly known as Twin Cities. It runs out of the northern suburbs here at Perth, and it was an awesome time. I really enjoyed it, and I got to play my own show every week, which focused on alternative rock music coming out of Western Australia. The thing that was obviously really cool about doing the show was that I could play whatever I want, as long as it was within, certain guidelines. And I also got to meet a lot of local bands and have them in for interviews and things like that. Got to have in Sly Withers, got to meet Spacey Jane where they were up and coming. The station also got to have in people like Psychedelic Porn Crumpets. But I would often be asked when I would say, I do this community radio show, do you do that at RTR? So RTR FM is the biggest community radio station we have here in Perth, and it's been around probably for the longest time. I've made comments about RTR a little bit before on this channel, and they have been somewhat negative comments, and people have been really defensive when I've made comments about RTR. But look, I really appreciate everything that RTR does, and I think they do a lot of great stuff, especially for WA music, but I think the station is very flawed in my opinion. And its greatest flaw, I think, is that it just lacks structure. To me, the station kind of just feels like a free-for-all every time you put it on. You never know what you're going to hear, like at all. It could be completely random. And I kind of get the appeal of that to some people, but I think generally that just doesn't work for a radio station. You want to be able to turn a station on and know roughly the sort of thing you're going to be hearing. And I think they do that because they want to be open and invite as many people on as possible as presenters and, musicians that play all different types of genres. But I think there needs to be a line, and I think they've just crossed it way too far, where you go on their website and you see a list of their shows, and it's like almost every hour of the day there's a different show on every day of the week. So you could go on Wednesday at 3 o'clock and it's a random show that only gets played at Wednesday at 3 o'clock that has this eclectic type of sound that it wants to play. I mean, that's cool for that person, that presenter, that they have a platform. But me, generally, as a listener, I kind of want to know, what I might hear at any given time of the day. And I think that's the issue people probably have with RTR without realizing it because they might flick through it on the radio and never stop because it's just something random playing all the time. So I think ideally, if I was in charge at RTR, I would make some really tough calls and put a lot more structure in place and say, like, we'll still have eclectic sounding shows, but only at these times of the day, and throughout the rest of the day we need a playlist. It's going to be focused on West Australian and Australian music, but this is the playlist and that's it. A little bit like a Triple J model, but with just more focus on WA. There's other good community radio stations around in Australia, such as FBI in New South Wales, 4ZZZ in Brisbane, that I believe have this structure a little bit more. So I really wish we had a community radio station here in Perth that did that sort of thing. Like if I go back to 89.7, it would just never happen there because the people controlling that place are all, of the older side. They're more there about the community radio sort of thing. They want to be involved in the community. It's not so much about the music in general, apart from like maybe some shows that run at nighttime. And I think the same could be said for most community radio stations. But I guess the question is, do we really need good radio stations anymore with Spotify and streaming being so popular? In my opinion, I think it would still be nice if we had a really good radio station here in Perth. The reason is kind of simple. If you think about a radio in a car, it's kind of nice just to turn your car on and for the radio to just start playing, and you don't even have to worry about clicking on any buttons. And then, you just start driving and it's playing something that you're comfortable hearing. I think that's the big difference between radio and TV, and why radio I think is still like a little stronger than TV is. Because, you think about plugging a TV into a satellite now, which hardly anyone does. That takes a lot of effort. You've got to actually sit down, choose to do that, choose to put it on, choose to change the stations. Whereas with radio in a car, you literally just turn the car on and it starts playing. So you don't really have to make choices. It's just there for you. So ultimately, I really wish we had a station like 96 FM was back in the day, with a good mix of classic and new up and coming alternative rock music that focused on its audience, the West Australian community and things like that. But I don't feel like we have one. What do you think? Do you think that we have one? Do you think it's RTR? Or do you have the same issues with RTR as I have? Thanks for checking out this video, everyone. If you like to hear this sort of stuff, please feel free to like and subscribe, and also comment your opinions down below.